John, that visionary of Patmos, wrote of a time when death would be no more, nor crying, nor mourning, nor pain. That time isn't yet, so we do grieve and we mourn. But basically, we are here today to celebrate a remarkable life. We are a motley crowd here, but we have a common sense of loss and a common admiration. So we can help each other and we can make a celebration of this life. I figure my brother lived about 3 times as intensively as many of us, at least as I did, and the 186 years isn't a bad lifetime. Bob and we 3 brothers of his grew up in the Midwest in small towns. Bob always said that was a good place to come from, a good place to grow up, and a good environment. The values of that kind of atmosphere I put down as family cohesion and honesty, learning and education, non-frivolous diligence, humility and service and tolerance, and a strong Protestant piety. We were given roots, an identity born of a basic trust in life and a sense of the worth of its structured integrity. We were given curiosity and wide interests. Bob was the imp among us. He was the first to plunge from the barn roof when we finished our glider, which cost $5.43 at the fabric and the lumber and the hardware store. He built the best airplane models, and when they were shop worn, he was quite willing to light them on fire and send them from the attic window. His painstakingly made tissue paper hot air balloons, miniature hot air balloons, I hope you've done that sometime. You may set the neighborhood on fire, but that'll be all right. They always seemed to be going the highest and the farthest out over the nighttime lake. He was our only athlete. Now, Bob was not given to formal religious expression, but neither to my knowledge did he ever mock. So because of his upbringing, because of our common grief and our gratitude, we will begin this service with a word from the scriptures that is familiar to our childhood home and a prayer. So hear these words from the Psalms. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless God's holy name. Bless the Lord who forgives your iniquities, heals all your diseases, satisfies you with good as long as you live, so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. Bless the Lord, all the created earth. Let us pray. Creative and loving author of our being, we bless you for the dedication and leadership of Robert Noyce, for the spaciousness of his spirit, for his energy and pleasure in the daily round, for his mind and ingenuity, for his tinkering and his warm concern for people, his impatience with cant and phoniness, all of them virtues fitting for your image in us. Receive now our gratitude, comfort all who mourn, keep us in your providential care, and give us at the last, we pray, a holy rest. Amen.
I'm Gordon Moore. I'd like to welcome you to this celebration of the life of an extraordinary man, Bob Noyce. We want this to be a celebration. Bob lived joyfully, and I know he would want any memorial to be the same. I'd like to begin by saying thanks to the Wickham singers who begin today's program. Many of you probably aren't aware that Bob led a madrigal group much like the Wickham singers when he was here in California. So it's especially fitting that they could be with us today. I'd also like to thank San Jose for proclaiming today as Bob Noyce Day. Now, I would like to introduce Bob's wife, Ann Bowers.
Thank you, Gordon. And thank all of you for coming to share in our celebration. Bob lived well and fully, and we hope that you will have a full sense of that by the end of our ceremony. You have come from far and wide. There is at least one person here from Israel, people from all over the United States. And I would like to introduce you all, but I can't. So I'm going to introduce family and friends who are on stage and some that are in the audience who also have come from all over to share in this celebration. Penny Noyce, Bob's oldest daughter, is a Renaissance person just like her dad. She's the mother of 3. She's a doctor and an author. David Vadasz, son of Les and Judy Vadasz, one of those Hungarians, you know, has been a friend of ours for a very long time, shared in many adventures, has just graduated from UCLA and is going to finally earn a living. Kathy Cohen. Actually, Kathy was Bob's friend, and she came as part of Bob's dowry. So what could I do? It's one of our oldest and best friends. Richard Hodgson has been Bob's friend and mentor and business colleague since the various early days of Fairchild, and has really been like a dad to Bob in many ways. And some family in the audience. Bob's oldest child, Bill. I don't know if the lights are going to work here or not. Bill is a software project leader at DEC, father of 3, and also his wife, Joan, and 3 children are here, and they're from Hollis, New Hampshire. Bob's daughter, Polly, has just arrived from Kenya. She and her husband run an agricultural school there, and Davis and the 3 boys are here as well. Thanks. And Bob had 2 other brothers as well who are here. Big brother Don. There's big brother Don. Don is a retired professor of chemistry at Berkeley. His wife Betty is here, and I think all 3 of their children, if I counted right this morning. Youngest brother Ralph is at IBM in San Jose. Penny's husband, Leo, and their 3-year-old. She's going to be a terror as a teenager. Yeah, she is now. Okay. And my family, which pales in comparison to Noyce's, my brother Tom, my mother, and my niece Liza are all here. So we are surrounded by a great loving family. And then there's one more very special person I'd like to introduce to you, and you will hear more about him as we go along. Grant Gale. We think Grant Gale really started this all. Bob's physics professor from Grinnell. And thank you all for coming. We're here together this afternoon because I think in some way each one of us suspects or knows that our life has been changed, that our hero is gone. I lived with Bob for 15 years. We were the best of friends. We were companions in a wide range of activities. We worked together. I really thought I understood his influence in the world, but I obviously underestimated it drastically. I'm really floored at the range of expressions of love and admiration and respect that have come from all around the world. Many of them from folks in this audience, and they've been wonderful. Haven't been able to read them all because they make me cry. But I thank you for your expressions of support and your presence. I think we're really here to celebrate some of the core values that Bob really embodied. Many of you have known him publicly, and I thought I would talk a little bit about what he was like up close. Remarkably, he was the same guy you saw in public. He's probably the most authentic person I have ever known. It is true that he was incredibly smart, but he never used his intelligence to posture. He could always reduce a problem to its simplest form. Well, almost always. The intercom system in our house had him baffled, and it had for 2 years. It really bugged him. Those of us around him who are competitive types, and most of us were, got very frustrated because it seemed like Bob could do absolutely everything well. He was a natural athlete, an excellent pilot, and a more than competent musician. He could write limericks, and he could even spell. He could fix anything, and he would do that very happily if it involved a trip to the hardware store, which is the only place he ever went shopping. But despite all those abilities, he never made anybody else feel incompetent. And in fact, I think many of us are here because he encouraged us to be more than we ever thought we could be. Still, looking for a compelling essence, and I think that came from his deeply held belief that people are inherently good, and he had an abiding optimism that things would always turn out okay. The other night we were laughing about how Bob sort of ambled through the world dropping things. He dropped ideas, he dropped his wallet, he dropped his papers, he dropped medals, left things in hotel rooms, and you'll be happy to know, I'm sure, that even legends leave their socks on the floor. And he had faith that all of these things, the ideas and the stuff, would be picked up, and they generally were. The ideas were grabbed by others who were impelled not to disappoint Bob, and the stuff got picked up by somebody, and he never knew who. Bob never wasted much time on that little stuff. He was a strategist, a designer, an inventor of new ways. It seemed to me that he was always looking in the future when I was trying to balance the checkbook. But he always believed that you could invent the future, and he made serious commitments of time and resources to do so. I'd like to suggest that the world might perhaps be a little brighter if we could all adopt Bob's approach to life. In a world that tends to expect the worst, Bob Noyce expected the best, and he was very seldom disappointed. But Bob would say, okay, Bowers, enough of this. You're blowing things all out of proportion. And for once, I will listen and stop now. And I would like to have Penny.
Over the past 2 weeks, as friends and acquaintances who know nothing of electronics or technology have offered me their condolences for my father's death, I've found myself wanting to tell them the magnitude of his contribution to our nation and our everyday lives. But here in Silicon Valley, I know there's no need of that. You're all well aware of his public accomplishments. So I'd like to tell you about how he was as a father and what he gave to us, his children. I remember camping, building dams across streams, flying model airplanes. I remember learning to do a backflip. I remember the madrigal music that used to drift upstairs on Wednesday nights. I remember that when my father came home late at night from a business trip, he would always wake us up to say goodnight. And I remember the comfort of his form standing at my bedside with his cigarette glowing in the dark. I remember a spring fair at our elementary school when my father was the first one up in the annual father versus son softball game. I was so proud of him, the youngest and handsomest father there. Then the first pitch came in, and he knocked it out of the park. I cheered wildly, but the other parents present only clapped politely because, as I realized later, actually, the fathers weren't supposed to win the game. But my father couldn't help himself. He always threw himself entirely into the activity at hand. And in whatever he did, he always tried to excel. And he usually succeeded. He taught us by example to be doers, not bystanders. He never watched sports on television, nor did he have time to read about other people's adventures. He was too busy pursuing adventures of his own. He taught us to ski. 1,000 times he picked us up from a snowbank, dusted us off, and led us down the hill again, the 4 of us children in our matching orange jackets, so we could share his exhilaration. Some of my happiest memories of recent years are skiing with him in Colorado and in the Bugaboos. My father had a voracious appetite for knowledge. He was never intellectually lazy, nor would he let us be. When, as children, we asked him to help us with our math or physics homework, he would never just help with the problem at hand. He always took us back to first principles and made us figure the whole thing out for ourselves, which used to drive us crazy. And as an adult, I found that when he was in the room, the conversation was always animated and exciting. He was always interested in what we were doing, always full of questions. In our own work, he taught us to follow our hearts, and we always knew that we could count on his assistance, practical and inspirational, in whatever our hearts led us to choose. He told me once that if I followed my dream and tried to become a writer, he would support me when I grew up. I think he wanted us to be daring, as he was. Of course, there were some limits to how daring he wanted us to be, but he seldom forbid us anything. Instead, he appealed to reason. When I was 13, I became very interested in skydiving, and that did have him worried. So he did 2 things. He brought home from Intel a man swathed head to foot in casts and bandages and said, "Penny, I'd like you to meet this skydiver. He had a little trouble with his parachute." And then, for my 14th birthday, he gave me gliding lessons, and it worked. I was diverted. He enjoyed his work. He enjoyed his success, but that was never an end in itself. It was sort of like the wake that comes up when you're speeding along in a boat. Often we would read about his honors and awards in the newspaper because he had forgotten to mention them to us. What mattered most, he taught us, was to do our best and to have fun doing it. 2 years ago, when I was sitting with my father on a chairlift, he told me that he planned to live past 90. At first, that surprised me, knowing how poorly he tolerated infirmity. But he was such an optimist. He confidently expected to be agile and animated and active to the end. That part of his wish was granted. And I'm happy for that. I think he crammed 90 years of living into 62. But he has 12 grandchildren, and I wanted them all to get the chance to know him well, with his warmth and honesty and generosity, and most of all, his excitement about life. I wanted them to have a chance to absorb his values. I was talking to my brother and sister this morning, and after 2 weeks to absorb his death, we'd all arrived at pretty much the same set of resolutions. First, the determination to treasure our families and loved ones. And second, to take our dreams, even the ones we feel most tentative or timid about, and to pursue those dreams with all our daring and all our hearts. And we're going to teach our children to do the same.
I'm Dave Vadasz. The first time I met Mr. Noyce was when I was 8 years old. And for the past 13 years, I've called him Mr. Noyce. I'll continue to do so now. The first time I met him was when we went over to their house for dinner and to watch a movie. I remember asking my mother on the way there, "What do you say to a man like him?" And the reason I asked the question was because I had heard so much about him and all the things that he had done. And I was not only in awe of him, but I was intimidated by him. Although I had started the night intimidated, I ended the night excited about how nice he had been to me. And in retrospect, I feel that his niceness towards me wasn't just a good rapport with kids, but instead was the kid inside himself that was able to relate to me. Each of us thinks of Mr. Noyce something different. Most everybody knows of his accomplishments in the worlds of business and technology, but I remember him as a childhood friend. When talking about kids, one thinks of adjectives such as curious, adventurous, and fun-loving, and Mr. Noyce was all of the above. I remember ski trips, much as everybody else in here does, or many people do, where most of the people involved were adults, where the only two kids were my brother and I, Jeff, and myself. But inevitably, Mr. Noyce would lead Jeff and I through the trees, and the rest of the adults would go down the marked trails. I think Mr. Noyce figured that any trail without, or any terrain without a name had to have been good because it was an adventure, and he liked the adventure. He also learned soon, after he led us through the trees, that once he led us through the trees, he had to go over all the bumps with us. And I remember a specific time when he went over the bumps with us, and he ended up falling and ripping his jumpsuit. So the invincible Mr. Noyce was also human. Skiing wasn't the only thing that Jeff and I did with Mr. Noyce. From mucking around in his lakes for crayfish, to fishing for trout, to seeing adventure movies such as Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark, we always tried to do these things together, these childlike things together. From Mr. Noyce's achievements, one can assume that he had dreams. And from my perspective, I see a kid with dreams and a man who fulfilled his dreams.
We all know how much Bob has contributed to the world, but he also gave very richly to his friends. And my husband and I were among those most fortunate to be called his friends. There are not too many people that one can really enjoy traveling with, but Bob is certainly one of them. And over the years, we were able to explore the world with him and with Anne, sharing his sense of adventure, flying, scuba diving, climbing, wandering about in Tibet, sailing down the Septic River in a dugout canoe. Bob could always out-ski and out-dive all of us, but he never made us feel that he was holding us back, or that he was being held back by our sort of slow skiing, and that was something I really appreciated. Perhaps the best part of it all were the conversations that happened either on the ski lift or sitting on after diving and working out hard, conversations that ranged from history to technology to science to art to business. It was very exciting for all of us. But typical of Bob, he was never afraid of anything, and he was always a leader. And he would lead us sometimes up a pyramid in Mexico by moonlight, or into the river, the absolutely black and crocodile-infested waters of the Septic River, to escape from the heat and the mosquitoes. Needless to say, not everybody followed him, but some of us were crazy enough to do so. And it was a great view from that pyramid in the moonlight. I'll sort of never forget the sense of the Indians that were out there and the sense of mystery that Bob felt and that we were able to share with him. The only time in all these adventures that I can remember him really getting ticked off was when the housing that he had so carefully engineered for his underwater camera flooded, and he was very, very upset. But he immediately started building a new one for the next trip. And he was always very patient with me and helping me figure out my camera gear and get it going. The only time he was stumped was when my fancy new electronic camera started in Bangkok screaming, "Help, help." If you can really imagine it, the words came out, "Help, help, help." We've never seen it since. We don't know what did it, but that stopped Bob. Actually, no, there was one other time that he was stumped, and that was when Anne had just been given the first Lisa computer, and we were all playing with it, and he managed to lose the wastebasket. I don't know how that's possible. But he did it, and he never found it again, and Apple was very embarrassed at how that could be done. Yeah, I met Bob over 30 years ago when I joined the small madrigal group that he was leading. He had very high standards, and he pushed us hard to sing well, but he never made me feel bad about the fact that I would go flat from time to time. And I said goodbye to Bob this last week in England. We found out about his death. And my husband and I walked down to Salisbury Cathedral at night, and they were rehearsing Brahms' Requiem. We stood outside and listened, and I could see Bob conducting us, all the expressions on his faces as he conducted that. And then I had the sense that he's somewhere conducting an orchestra where nobody sings flat. Thank you.
Family and friends of Bob Noyce, with all the words that have been written and spoken in the last 2 weeks about Bob so eloquently, there's very little left that one can say to embellish the image that we all have of him. There are several sides to Bob Noyce as I've known him over the years. I mean, we all recognize him for his high technology achievements, his management skills, but he had a great human side too, which I think is being expressed here today by his family and close friends that often is overlooked when people think about a leader in industry. I remember Bob when he came first to Fairchild as a research director who had no real interest in being even a simple general manager of that small operation. And to think what's happened since that started over 30 years ago when he became a co-founder and CEO of Intel, the most successful semiconductor company in the industry, in my opinion, today. A lot of comments have been made about the awards which he's received. They're very important scientific awards. But in my mind, I think that nothing excelled the award that he received, which he wore to my house in Aspen a couple of years ago for lunch. It was a yellow jumpsuit and was given to him, I think, for I don't know how many 100,000 feet of downhill skiing in deep powder. And as hot as it was in that house, he would not take off that jumpsuit. And I asked him why, and he said, well, you know, one of the guests here is Ben Eisman, who is a very well-known doctor in the area, and he was wearing his K2 jacket. He said, I'm not going to have a K2 jacket take precedence over a 100,000-foot jumpsuit. So that's where he really recognized what achievement awards were about. Thinking of times in our house in Aspen where I saw Bob more recently in an informal way, Penny reminded me of having been there today. And I remember one time he was there in the house with the family and the children, and they were getting a little bored with all the grown-up talk, and he decided to do somersaults with them on the floor. And here was Bob Noyce, not so young then either, doing somersaults with the children, following him around our room, and everyone was completely amazed. But that's what I call about the humanity side of Bob Noyce. During the early days of Fairchild, we spent a lot of time together. We traveled to Japan and negotiated the first semiconductor license with NEC. That was either the best thing we did or the worst thing we did in our history. And then we went on to Italy and had a joint venture with Olivetti. And despite working hard and long hours at that time, we always found time to take a weekend off and go skiing in St. Moritz. Bob asked me to go skiing with him then, and he never asked me again, and I never understood why. We had interesting times in getting established the first plant in Hong Kong. And in those days, we saw a lot of the world, and it wasn't quite as easy to get around as it is today. The thing that I really think most about when I think back about Bob Noyce is that I think many of us think of him as a Renaissance man in the industry, from technology, and as a human being. But I think of him mostly as a friend and associate for over 30 years. Thank you.
The Osgood File, Charles Osgood, CBS News. Today, in the era of the microchip, inventors work in teams, and individual names are not very well known to the public at large. Do you know, for example, who Robert Noyce was? He was the co-inventor of the microchip, the man who changed the world.
The rest of the world. How does the rest of the world relate to you? MIT gave me a technical background to do work in semiconductors, but none of the orientation of where you fit into society. I think most of that did come from Iowa. Oh, Grant Gale, marvelous person. He got me interested in physics. I used to go over and mow his lawn. I went to high school in Cornell, too. And so he kept me employed, if you will. And he got me interested in going on to graduate school in physics. And he also got me interested in transistors. Bill Shockley was known as the inventor of the transistor, along with Bardeen and Bratton. I wanted to play in the big leagues. I had given a couple of papers. Bill Shockley had heard of them or had been in the audience and invited me to come out and join his organization out in Palo Alto. We had a great experience at Fairchild and got things going very well out there. It was a unique time because all of us who had an equity stake in the company, and so people were very, very highly motivated to succeed. I say that the integrated circuit came out of my own laziness, that we took those transistors that were all nicely arranged on a piece of silicon, cut them into tiny little pieces, and then, of course, we'd ship them to the customer and they'd put them all right back together again. Why not just cut out all of that middle ground and just put them together while they were still on the silicon? So that's what we did. Ideas are a dime a dozen, perhaps. The real ideas that survive are the ones that can be driven on all the way through into the marketplace, where you actually have something to sell. Fairchild had set up an example, too, that it was possible to go out and start from scratch and succeed. At the time, I said I wanted to prove that it wasn't just luck that Fairchild worked. I needed to prove to myself that we could do it on our own. It has been very satisfying to start a company and see it grow and develop a different kind of company around a different way of doing things, which is looking at human worth rather than the usual autocratic organization of the company. I think there is a new management style evolving now, which is paying much more attention to the needs of all employees, not just the select few at the top. It's much less autocratic, much more democratic. In a changing environment, democratic management style is much more effective. If you're an autocrat, you can make a real blooper, and the people that know better are afraid to tell you about it. In a democratic organization, they'll tell you. What America needs to do is changing, and I think that we're right in the middle of that change at Cemitech. And I have always liked to be in the middle of a changing environment. There's a real challenge in making that all work. America's largest business is the electronics business these days. That's not widely recognized, but electronics is bigger than autos and steel and aerospace all put together. If we don't succeed in maintaining a healthy semiconductor industry in America, the chances are that we're going to lose a lot of the other jobs in the electronics business. If we can succeed in our task, this will be one of the best investments that the government has ever had in terms, if you look at it, if you will, as a venture capital deal on the part of the government, it'll be spectacular, and we expect to succeed.
Father of Silicon Valley is a term I hear used to describe Bob Noyce. How do you feel when you hear that term?
A little humble, a little proud. What can I say? I love the term, and I think that what we did at Fairchild and carrying on has really had a major influence on Silicon Valley. It is named Silicon Valley. The impact of the personal computer, the fact that it is an everyman's tool, not just that for the scientists or the specialists, I think is the one that is the most profound. And I sort of have enjoyed being a part of that whole revolution. America has gotten a little discouraged, I think, in the last 10 or 15 years as our standard of living is stagnated, and that of the rest of the world has been coming up very fast. And I think that we need to re-examine what we're doing and how we're doing it, and compare it to what other countries are doing, and try to learn from those examples. We don't have all the answers. We can learn from watching others as well.
Well, the world has changed in many, many ways in the last couple of decades, and technologically, many of those changes have been built on integrated circuitry. Other inventors stand on Bob Noyce's shoulders.
Necessity, they say, is the mother of invention. We have a lot of necessity in our society today. And I think the time is here for inventing new approaches, new solutions to these various problems, so that we can indeed maintain America, and indeed the rest of the world as well, as the land of opportunity for all of those who will be the achievers of the future.
Bob arrived to work for Bill Shockley on Friday. I arrived the following Monday. I guess I've been chasing along behind him ever since. Organizationally, he was my boss for over 20 years during this career, in several positions in a couple of organizations. But I never really felt he was my boss. He was my colleague. That's the way he treated everyone. They were all Bob's equals. He had a number of peculiar attributes that led to his success. One of them was that he was not intimidated by authority or by the conventional wisdom. I can look back in the early days at Fairchild when we were trying to develop a transistor. I had responsibility for finding the metallization that you could put on top to attach the wires to. Everybody knew, and especially every physicist knew, that aluminum would make a good contact to one kind of silicon, but not to the other. In fact, it was known so strongly that Bell Labs never even tried it. So I was looking for some complex mixture of metals that would work, making a good contact to both kinds, and I had gone through about everything I could think of in the periodic table, till one day Bob came by and said, "Why don't you try aluminum?" It won't work, but I tried everything else. Guess what we use for making contacts to all of our semiconductor devices ever since? The invention of the integrated circuit at Fairchild occurred in a particular meeting that I remember well because I wasn't there. I missed this important point in history. Fairchild was working on the planar transistor, a very important idea and basic technology underlying the integrated circuit. And a meeting occurred between the research staff to see how that might be used to make something more complex with several things hooked together. And it required two things. One, some way of electrically isolating one transistor from the next, and two, a way of making interconnections from one part of the circuit to the next. During that meeting, Bob invented solutions to both those problems, so-called junction isolation and the use of metallization adherent to the oxide over the film. These were the key inventions to take the planar transistor technology to the practical integrated circuit. Now, the integrated circuit wasn't an immediate success. As we went out with this idea to our customers, and our customers were principally the circuit designers in the electronics companies, the first reaction was, well, we can't use your circuit for all of our applications. The implication being, and we're circuit designers, that'll put us out of a job if we did. So there was significant resistance to adopting these standard circuits. And Bob made another very important contribution to development of the industry to solve that problem. He said, we'll sell them to you for $1 a piece. That was significantly less than the cost of the parts for them to build their own circuits. That was a very major step in establishing the integrated circuit's importance, and indeed it established a new technology for the semiconductor industry till today. Whenever there's a problem, you lower the price. Of course, that was as revolutionary a concept to the people within Fairchild as it was to the customers, because our cost of making those circuits at that time was far above $1. But he realized that the volume that would be created would allow that to become a successful product. Another story about Bob, I remember the first Christmas at Intel. Bob got on the PA system a while after lunch and said, "Why didn't everybody go home early today?" And most people took advantage of that and were leaving, and some of us were hanging around there getting ready to go. One of them opened the door to the back room, and the entire back of the building was flooded. A cooling water pipe on one of the pieces of equipment had broken, and here was as much water as you can contain on a flat concrete surface, all over the entire back of the building. So Bob took off his shoes, rolled up his pants. We found where the squeegee and mop were hidden, and there was Bob on Christmas Eve pushing a squeegee, operating a mop, and not just doing it, but doing it happily, because he knew he was doing the job that had to be done at the moment. And I think that really characterizes Bob. He was always doing the job that had to be done.
How to summarize a relationship and friendship and the feelings, especially the feelings that went on for 33 years when it has to do with Bob Noyce, is very difficult. The one characteristic I think is most important, and what I'd like to remember him most for, is the desire and commitment to make things that he believed in happen. He, more than anyone else I know, believed it was his mission to leave the world a better place than he found it. All of us talk a lot about how an entrepreneur should be concerned about the building of a company rather than trying to figure out how to build a business in order to get rich. Bob epitomized that philosophy. Bob tired of the day-to-day running of Intel, and I don't think it was that so much as he really and truly didn't like to tell people their shortcomings, demote them, or especially to ask them to leave. That aspect of being chief executive officer just tore Bob apart. Bob, for a long time, worried about our losing our competitive advantage. While it would have bothered him if he thought we lost this advantage fairly, and he would have said, "We have to do better." But he, as so many of the rest of us, felt that we were losing due to unfair competition and that our government was not helping. So instead of enjoying the fruits of 30 years of work, Bob felt that he had to do something and began speaking out, and then started to lobby to anyone who would listen, or even those who would not listen in Washington. Then he became involved in the formation of Semitech, because this was the one way to self-help. And when Semitech nearly died a borning because there was no one with the stature to run it, Bob felt he could not live with himself unless he saw it through. And at the age of 60, when most of us start to take on less and move a little slower, Bob took on more and moved around a little faster. So getting back to the beginning, over a 33-year friendship, there are many things to remember. But the most enduring memory is how much Bob wanted to make the things he believed in happen, and in most cases, achieve that objective. I, like the rest of us, are better off for knowing Bob and will miss him very much.
On June 4th, the California Senate adjourned in memory of Dr. Robert N. Noyce. I will be presenting a memoriam resolution to the family, and you may have seen one hanging outside in the foyer, which will go to Intel. In this resolution, we acknowledge the many accomplishments and the high esteem in which he was held. The family has also asked that I read from 3 statements that were made in Austin, Texas, at the time of the memorial service there. From Secretary of Commerce Robert Moschbacher. As President Bush said earlier this week, Dr. Noyce is as great as Henry Ford and Alexander Graham Bell. Through his leadership and foresight, he touched the lives of people around the globe and continues to do so today. His dedication and service to the business community and the public are an example for all of us. And from the House Majority Leader, Dick Gebhardt, when no one else was up to the task of shepherding U.S. semiconductor and semiconductor equipment manufacturers toward making future generations of integrated circuits, Bob Noyce stepped forward. Willingly, he led an effort to bring a promising scenario to life, the U.S. government and industry working together toward common goals. And from Eric Bloch, the director of the National Science Foundation. To me, one of the most important aspects of Bob's character was his commitment to action, to move forward regardless of the difficulties, to undertake what others thought impossible. He saw the need for the semiconductor industry to react to foreign competition earlier than anyone else. And where others counseled defensive actions, his approach was to get right to the basics and strengthen the foundations of the industry. For him, that meant better education, generating new knowledge through more effective research, and applying that knowledge rapidly to generate new products needed to compete on the world market. Most of what has been written about Dr. Robert N. Noyce in these last few weeks has been about his exceptional skills as a scientist and as a manager. I want to talk about Bob Noyce, citizen. And in calling him Bob, I mean no disrespect, for I had nothing but admiration for this incredibly humble, nice man. Bob and I met about a decade ago at a dinner for Cornellians, Cornell University being the alma mater of his wife, Ann Bowers, my husband, Jim, and I. In the course of the conversation, I revealed that I was considering running for county supervisor. As we left the dinner, Bob said to me, "Let me know if I can help." Well, a week or 2 later, I called Bob and told him that I had decided to enter the race. I asked if he could give me $1,500 to hire a consultant to develop a strategy for the campaign and put together a budget proposal. Bob said, "Sure. Can you meet me at the dentist Monday morning?" So from a dentist's chair on Welch Road in Palo Alto in February of 1980, my political career was launched. Bob served as my co-chair in that campaign and in the 1984-85 campaigns for the state Senate. In the political world, we are often judged by who our supporters are. I was indeed fortunate to have Bob as a supporter. Many of you have known or read about the fact that Bob liked to go helicopter skiing. But did you ever wonder what happens when you're up there in the mountains and it starts to rain? Well, back in 1987, Bob, Bill Vadasz, and my husband, and I believe Penny was there, found themselves probably in the bar, idled by the rainstorm. But never once to sit idle, they proceeded to found the California Legal Reform Project. This project was dedicated to civic reform and was the result of their sincere belief that the productivity and thus the competitiveness of American businesses is severely hampered by the litigiousness of the American society. And with the able help of Tom Campbell and Tom Scornia, and the financial contributions probably of many of you here in this audience, the California Legal Reform Project has resulted in successful legislation and is now merged with the statewide Association for California Tort Reform. These two stories, I believe, represent the diversity of Bob's interests and contributions. He excelled in his chosen field within high technology, but he accepted a citizen's responsibility to serve one's community in a broader sense. In his inaugural address, President Bush reminded people that any definition of success must include service to others. No one lived that edict better than Bob Noyce. My last conversation with Bob was on May 17th in Sacramento, the night before Intel's annual meeting. With that twinkle in his eye for which he was so well known, he told me about the ranch that he and Ann had just bought in Pescadero. It was obvious that he looked forward to returning to California. He also shared with me his frustration with the lack of support in Washington for Sematech and for improving America's competitive position internationally. Just as Ann challenged Sematech employees the day following Bob's death to fulfill Bob's legacy by making Sematech successful, I challenge those of you here this afternoon to mount a campaign in his memory that will educate the politicians in Washington and in Sacramento as to the challenges facing the high technology industries and our educational system. Bob left very big footsteps. Let us do our best to walk in them.
I've known and admired Bob Noyce for almost 30 years, starting as a young engineer when I first met him at a technical meeting. He was the undisputed leader of our industry. Bob was best known, of course, for his invention of the integrated circuit. This created our industry and made Bob a legendary figure already back in the early 1960s. Few other inventions have come close to his. It ranks with the most important contributions to science and technology ever, and in my opinion should have been awarded a Nobel Prize. As the futurist Isaac Asimov said, the invention of the integrated circuit was the most important event since man emerged as a life form. Bob didn't stop with the creation of technology. He also created companies. When he started with Fairchild, and he co-founded that company, which was a seminal company, where he and his associates invented the planar process, metal over oxide technology, and ultimately the integrated circuit. The careers of many of us here today were built on the foundations that he laid and the opportunities he helped create. In a broader sense, Bob was one of a handful of pioneers who began the whole high-tech economy of this region, setting the stage for enormous growth. After Fairchild, when Bob continued his entrepreneurship by co-founding Intel, and when we look at the list of products, the MOS DRAM, the MOS SRAM, the EEPROM, and the microprocessor, certainly in our industry, there's a very short list of what is left. Bob blazed the trail for others to found new companies and create new opportunities. Perhaps the biggest step of all for Bob was the transition from an individual technologist and entrepreneur to being an industry leader. Before most other executives in the semiconductor industry, Bob realized that for U.S. companies to compete effectively in the increasingly global marketplace, we needed greater unity among ourselves and participation in the political process in Washington. Bob helped found the SIA and was a key participant in molding the SIA into a potent political force. I remember at our first meeting at Ming's when we founded the SIA, most of us were total neophytes with respect to Washington. Bob was one of the few there that night that really understood what the process was all about. Bob had the vision to see beyond his immediate interests as a successful businessman, and that is a rare quality. He had the sense of industry and national obligation which led him to take on the demanding Cemitech presidency. And we should all take a lesson from this great patriot. Bob's creative brilliance and spirit of self-sacrifice for the greater good made him incredibly respected around the world. I have been in Japan and Korea the last 2 weeks, and the flood of genuine grief from the top management of the Asian semiconductor industry, both in public and private, emphasized the role Bob has played worldwide. We in the U.S. see him as captain of our team, but outside the U.S., he is perceived as the world industry leader. The Japanese have a word, sensei, to describe the teacher-student relationship, and this they applied to Bob. It's been said in the last few weeks that Bob is to the integrated circuit industry what Henry Ford was to the automobile industry, or Alexander Graham Bell to the telephone industry. He was unique, and it was a privilege to have known him.
And members of Bob's family, ladies and gentlemen, it has been said that the lamp of genius burns away more quickly than the lamp of life. But this was not so for our friend Bob Noyce. Both lights shone brightly until the end. The shadow of his passing cannot reach, much less quench, the light of his genius. It will endure, helping to illuminate our own best hopes and possibilities, while the light of his life helps to dispel the shadows of our daily doubts and the artificial strictures of self-imposed limitations. Like Jefferson, Bob Noyce preferred the light to darkness and the future to the past. He, too, was an uncommon man, possessed of the common touch. Likable and liking, he was someone whose friendships cut a wide swath. One would never guess from his quiet, easy, and friendly manner that here was a man who had wrought a revolution, whose brilliance had changed the world forever, until one noticed in the subtleties of his thinking the force and driving intelligence behind that modest style. Bob served as a regent of the University of California for 6 years. When he spoke, people did listen. His interest ranged as broadly as the university he served with such dedication and effect. He was interested in what our youngest students believed and in what our senior scholars thought, what our oceanographers and agriculturalists were learning, and what our humanists and social and behavioral scientists were studying, and what our scientists were discovering. Committed, caring, and collegial, Bob was a regent respected by all. He was also a friend, a genuine article, if I may put it that way. Unpretentious, sincere, solicitous, helpful, and authentic. Bob Noyce made a difference for the world in ways better chronicled by others than I, but he also made a difference in my life and in countless others. We shall remember him, and the world shall not soon forget.
As I reflect on these comments that we've all heard, the thing that stands out to me, and it must stand out to all of you, is that Bob, above everything else, was a special person. When you think about what made him special, three things come to mind. He was always active, super active. In fact, his sudden death made me realize that all the years that I've worked with him, I've never known him to miss a day of work, except due to self-inflicted injuries. His approach to life was characterized by an instinctive desire to make everything better. And I mean everything. Transistors, integrated circuits, our schools, our legal system, and this technological society that we live in. And lastly, Bob was a completely informal man. There wasn't an ounce of pomp or pomposity in him. So as we draw today's event to an end, it strikes me that the best way we can provide a memorial for him is to create within ourselves a living memorial to Bob Noyce. A living memorial in that we dedicate ourselves to improve ourselves a little bit along the lines that Bob was so great at. So let us each of us, more than ever before, do as compared to stand on the sidelines. Let us improve as many things as we come in contact with. And particularly, let each of us add a little bit of extra effort to improve that thing that Bob has devoted the last decade of his life to, our technological society, which is going to be the legacy to all of our children and their children. And last but not least, while we do all of that, let us, as Bob always has done, enjoy ourselves.
You're having as much fun as I am.
So let me now present engineering's highest award, the Charles Stark Draper Prize.
Thank you all very much for coming. Our celebration is going to end this afternoon with a special tribute outdoors. As a great many of you know, Bob truly loved flying, and he loved being a very competent pilot. So very quickly, unfortunately, since we're running a little late, Sonny Berry, who is Bob's friend and pilot, is going to fly over the courtyard outside in Bob's plane. So please join us outside for the flyover and a reception and the closing of the ceremonies. Thank you for coming.